boa tarde a todas e todos. É um prazer estar aqui, a gente iniciar o segundo dia do nosso curso, esse curso que reúne 3 cursos de pós-graduação da Universidade de São Paulo e da Universidade Federal do Rio de Janeiro, com os professores Rafael Winter Ribeiro, Mônica Bahia Schler, Vera Regina Tangari e Rubens de Andrade, para essa nossa segunda aula, que vai tratar sobre a Unesco e seus valores e critérios. Hoje, na aula de hoje, particularmente, a gente vai ter a ajuda técnica da Ana Paor, que está dando um oi aí para vocês, da Yasmin Darvish, que também vai dar um oi, e o Alex Lamounier, o professor Alex Lamounier, o nosso relator de hoje, que também, enfim, está aí para a gente contar com ele para essa relatoria, e a professora Vera que vai conduzir a aula de hoje, vai, enfim, explicar, e ao final, depois das palestras, a gente vai ter um tempo para as questões internas da disciplina após a saída dos palestrantes. Então, pediria a todos que segurassem as questões e as dúvidas para este momento final, às 16 horas, das 16 horas em diante, tá bom? Então, por gentileza, a gente vai, então, seguir com os nossos protocolos aqui da disciplina combinados. Vera, passo para você hoje. Obrigada, viu?
Muito obrigada, Flávia. Boa tarde a todas e a todos aqui na sala, né, que estão presentes. É um prazer estarmos de novo juntos, né, para mais um encontro, uma aula dessas, que será bastante importante para os nossos trabalhos, né, de todos os nossos campos profissionais, em pesquisa e em projeto também. Bem, a aula de hoje, ela tem um tema central, Unesco em Foco, Conceitos, Critérios, Valores de Integridade e Autenticidade. Teremos como, em inglês, né, Our Heritage Sites in Focus, Concepts, Criteria, Values and Attributes, Integrity and Authenticity. What can be improved? Nós temos como convidados a professora Patricia O'Donnell, do Iucn, United States, e também o professor Mike Turner, da Unesco, da Universidade de Bezalel, Academy of Arts and Design. Como a Flávia comentou, teremos a apresentação de Patrícia, em seguida do Mike, né? Eu vou agradecer também a participação, né, que vai me ajudar na relatoria, o professor Alex Lamounier, que ele é do Escola de Arquitetura e Urbanismo da UF, é pós-doutorando nosso do PROARQ, quem eu agradeço. Eu estarei mediando. Sou Vera Tangari, do mestrado profissional em Projeto e Patrimônio, e do PROARQ, né, Programa de Pós-Graduação em Arquitetura, da Faculdade de Arquitetura e Urbanismo da UFRJ. Então, estamos aqui exatamente lembrando que questões, as perguntas, por favor, façam pelo chat, né, para que depois, então, possamos, a cada fala, colocar as questões para os palestrantes, né? Podemos organizar aí o debate que vem em seguida. Hello, Patricia. It's a pleasure to have you here. Today, will be a very important second day of our course, and is going to focus on UNESCO, on the concepts, criteria, values, and Patricia and you and Mike were our special inviters for requests for the day. And I hope I'm going to have a very good afternoon and a very good lecture. And I thank you so much for accepting, also for collaborating with us with this course. I will present you, okay? Patricia é fundadora da Heritage Landscapes Preservation, Landscape Architects and Planners. Ela é mestre em Arquitetura da Paisagem e em Planejamento Urbano pela Universidade de Illinois, tem experiência na preservação histórica com ênfase na história, teorias e práticas da preservação da paisagem. É bacharel em Design pela State University of New York College in Buffalo. Patricia, the floor is yours. It's a pleasure to have you there. You can just begin your presentation. Thank you so much.
Great. Let me just say before I do the screen share that I appreciate the courtesy title of professor. but I have never been an academic. So for those of you who are in school, there are other paths out there. And I have always been a consultant and a business owner. And my business is now 34 years old, and we employ anywhere between 1 and 5 or 6. I think the biggest we ever were 8 people, and we focus entirely on landscapes of heritage that are public places. So we've been able to shape a practice working on the things we think are important.
Translate a little bit for the students. A Patrícia diz que ela, na verdade, agradece muito o título de professora, mas ela não é professora, ela é uma profissional praticante, esteve sempre à frente de uma empresa de que trabalha, como eu apresentei, né? Na área de preservação de paisagens, né? De projetos de paisagem também, preservação. Então, é a experiência profissional dela que é o peso, né, da carreira dela, e ela só, né, comentou que é o grande foco. Ela sempre foi uma profissional na área de consultoria, né, na área, e emprega, né, técnicos dentro da empresa dela, que é exatamente, né, como colocado no programa, enfim. Então, o que eu comento, que no fundo é exatamente a experiência dela que nos interessa também, esse tempo todo de prática que ela tem no campo, né? Thank you, Patricia. It's very important our experience. We know you are a very good professional and very important professional, and your experience is very important for our students. So it's very nice that you can just share with us your experience, your background. Thank you.
Yes, and as just another aside, it's World Landscape Architecture Month in April. So another call for celebration of our shared landscapes.
Ok. Hoje abril é o mês, né, de arquitetura paisagística no mundo inteiro, um mês mundial dedicado. Então, ela está muito feliz também de estar podendo falar sobre esse assunto nesse mês tão especial para o campo da arquitetura paisagística. É um prazer muito grande mesmo, Patrícia. Ok, now the floor and the screen is yours, Patrícia. Thank you.
Great, thanks. So let me just offer my greetings. It's a pleasure to be here. The 2 images that I start with are drawn from my state party, the United States, to capture first an unauthorized but well-accepted monument to York, who was the only African-American who accompanied the Lewis and Clark expedition and an enslaved person. This monument was placed here in the middle of the night by a sculptor who remains nameless because he wanted the sculpture to be about the issue, not him. And second, I have Amanda Gorman, the youth poet at the January US Presidents and Vice Presidents inauguration at the west front of the US Capitol. And the reason I've started with these is because they're symbolic touchstones that demonstrate that our global cultural and natural heritage is alive and transforming constantly. Our shared tangible and intangible heritage of local value or outstanding universal value, as inscribed on the World Heritage List, is a complex system, deeply layered and evolved. And today we're surrounded by the challenges of our time with daily climate change and crisis updates, tourism barely reopening, pressing complex economic, social, and environmental issues, all facing humanity and the living species worldwide and our planet Earth. So to give you just a little overview on our World Heritage, colleagues and now me as well have joined this call for global action from a citizen and civil society basis. And our World Heritage works as an integrator to link themes, regions, generations, narratives, practices, and actors, and find tools, more tools, understand issues and bring forward solutions, advance the protection of the Earth's natural and cultural treasures, shape 2021 as a year of open, inclusive thematic debates for co-learning and knowledge building, seek diverse, inclusive voices of citizens, and form a voluntary coalition of concerned individuals in an ever-widening mosaic.
I'm very sorry to disturb you. It seems we have a problem with the sharing of the screen. Could you please maybe cancel and share again, see if we can solve it?
Sure.
Yes,
No,
thank you.
no problem. So where are we now?
Oh, yes, now it's okay.
Great. So I think one of the key initiatives overall is putting heritage more firmly in the lives of communities. So I wanted to go back and reviewing Mike's paper, which you'll see later in video, that the UNESCO Constitution was a response to World War I, and there are some key phrases that are resonating still today when we talk heritage. Democratic principles of dignity, equality, and mutual respect for men, note, not necessarily women. Peace, founded upon intellectual and moral solidarity of mankind, not humankind. Free exchange of ideas and knowledge, increase of communication, and a purpose of mutual understanding for a truer and more perfect knowledge of each other's lives, which was intended to be a foundation for peace. So I would suggest to you that heritage is an important platform to build the mutual trust that's required toward a global peace. Article 5, are we still viewing okay? Great. Of the World Heritage Convention is particularly important to our World Heritage because it is not fully functional. What it indicates in Article 5 is that each state party, as appropriate for each country, adopt policies to give cultural and natural heritage a function in the life of community. And the rest of these are all related to those responsibilities of each state party. But I think it's important for us to take a little step back and talk about whose values this heritage. What are the values and who is it that values it? So worldwide, we have 213 natural sites of varying scales and 39 mixed sites. And these designations of natural sites may include the lands of First Peoples, Indigenous, and tribes that are unceded, that have essentially been taken over and put boundaries upon through the UNESCO World Heritage System. And natural sites are facing increasing threats related to climate change and abuse for profit, among other threats. From local to global, we have 869 listed cultural sites. It doesn't actually mean that many cultural properties. There's quite a few more, which I'll talk to later. And these are valorized, but they often highlight the dominant culture, the powerful, and the elite. There are sites of community, conscience, innovation, and courage that are also valorized, but to a much lesser degree. And we have untold stories of slavery and oppression and service, although these stories are becoming more widespread. The presentation of heritage continues to evolve toward inclusive stories, but it is perhaps even still rare to speak about women, children, justice, Black, Indigenous, and all of the other aspects of the non-dominant society. Then the other important question I think that we should be attending to is who benefits. The purposes of valorization are many, and when we talk about nature, it's about retaining biodiversity and protecting it. When we talk about culture, it is recognition and protection, local and national pride, and mutual respect through shared understanding with an intent towards social cohesion, fostering global peace. If we go back to the comments on whose values, there's a disconnect. Because if there are people who don't value that heritage or aren't connected to that heritage, what are the purposes for them? So if we're moving daily with a drumbeat toward inclusivity, I think these are really important to think about, because in contemporary society, the benefits are often economic and sectorial, with tourism, travel, lodging, and souvenirs, low-paying jobs for locals, minorities, poor, oppressed, and displaced may gain little or nothing and may not connect to the heritage. So one of the issues for heritage in my work is if people don't care about it, it doesn't persist. We lose that heritage. So the question comes to us, what kinds of heritage would be more inclusive, or how can we change the narrative of the heritage we have already affirmed and valorized to make those more inclusive? So let me give you a quick example. At Robben Island Prison, it's a World Heritage Site because those who were fighting for apartheid to topple, the Black peoples of South Africa, were imprisoned here for decades. And the interpreters of this site today who guide the visitors, when I was there in 2012, were former prison inmates telling this dark story from a personal viewpoint. That first person voice is being lost over time, and a new interpretation will supplant it, because those people who actually spent their time in that prison are dying off. So hopefully the strong connections will come forward, and the struggles of Black freedom in South Africa will have the same.
Sorry, I think that
the microphone is off.
Is off. Please, Patricia, can you turn on your microphone, please?
Yeah. Okay, so let me show you a model here. You all understand that the three components of sustainability, which were put forward in the Brundtland Commission's report, Our Common Future, in the 1980s, are environment, economy, and society. So this model that I've developed and that recently came out in a UNESCO report on heritage cities as an option for thinking about the pillars, I think culture and nature permeates all three of these, and that heritage sustains. And further, I would say, if we shift to the notion of value and we use the word capital, people understand cultural and natural capital. And then if we talk about assets instead of resources, we have a nuanced but very important difference. A resource is something that can be pillaged and used for profit. An asset has value in and of itself. So let's look at something familiar for you. This is the Rio Sea and City and Mountains. And because I come from a landscape architecture and planning disciplines, I think about heritage as place-specific and often large in scale. This view of Rio captures the image and reality of an evolved cultural landscape, inscribed in 2012 as the Carioca landscape between the sea and the mountains, to include the diversities and genders of this city, identifying World Heritage inscription as the assets of sea, iconic massifs, beaches, mountain park, and botanic garden. So the values explicitly stated in the OUV for Rio, in quote, say, an exceptionally dramatic landscape punctuated by a series of forested mountains that tower over the city, rising to the uppermost peak of the Tijuca Massifs at 1,021 meters high and cascading down to the coasts, as well as the extensive designed landscapes on reclaimed land along the Copacabana Bay, which together with flamenco and other parks have contributed to the outdoor living culture of the city. The criterion for this are 5 and 6, and it's important to recognize that criterion 7 additionally is addressing inspiration of the city in art, literature, poetry, and music. So clearly intangible as well as tangible heritage. I look at landscapes in components, and this list gives you a sense of what you need to look at and understand: natural systems, land uses and patterns, spatial and visual organization and relationships, vegetation, circulation, water, structures, buildings, and the vocabulary of small scale elements that make up a place. So to shift to the intangible heritage, let's make this go away. Yeah. Okay. I offer you San Juan Chamula, a living Mayan village in Mexico, as a view in front of the church where ritual is underway. And they have a practice of going to the mountains every week and bringing down young trees as symbols of life and death. Local traditions and beliefs, festivals, worship, iconic shared places, places of memory, and all of the related issues are important when we think about the intangible. One of the ways we can look at intangible heritage is places of worship. And here we have an image of the Temple of Heaven on the World Heritage List, in part because it is the only place of worship dedicated to heaven on the planet. So there's this uniqueness that we ascribe when we talk about our values. We're always talking about the best, the most expressive, the strongest, the most indigenous species, the greatest degree of biodiversity. So we're always looking for that hierarchical relationship. To link the tangible and intangible, I offer this interesting sacred grove in Nigeria, now seen as a symbol of identity for all the Yoruba people because it is probably the last present in the Yoruba culture. It testifies to a once widespread practice of establishing sacred groves outside of all settlements. So it's interesting because we had a presenter from Nigeria in an earlier OWH webinar, and she talked about how this site is really important, but we often list a site when it is almost gone. So here we're saying the Yoruba people are symbolizing all of their sacred groves, now not extant, in this one remaining grove. So the culture and time have already removed many of the evidences, and we give a bonus to survival. So I think it's important for us also to understand that we're talking about the cultural and the natural side, cultural diversity and biodiversity. So starting with biodiversity, if we bring cultural diversity into place, and this is a diagram that I've been refining over the past 7 years. It comes originally from the Connecting Practices Initiative of IUCN and ICOMOS. Then we move to nature, and we see natural habitats and human-shaped habitats that fall into biological diversity. So let's delve into the nature side for a minute. If you do a quick search of nature and indigenous, you find, just as a sample, some individual sites and some mixed sites. So you would be familiar with Paraty in Ilha Grande and its cultural and biodiversity. It is a mixed site. The image here is from the Blue and John Crow Mountains of Jamaica. But you see these sites come up when you test the World Heritage List for indigenous, and this is the nature side. There's a long list of these. I've only given you a few countries. So diversity in nature, I'd like to speak just for a moment to the UN Convention on Biological Diversity of 1992, which will have its 30th anniversary in 2022, aligning to the World Heritage Convention 50th anniversary. I quote the preamble here. Conscious of the intrinsic value of biological diversity and of the ecological, genetic, and then listen to the shift here toward human. This is scientific, ecological, and genetic. Then we go to social, economic, scientific, educational, cultural, recreational, and aesthetic. So a long list of values being ascribed to biological diversity. And that it is a common concern of humankind that we maintain these life-sustaining systems of the biosphere. A little farther down, it recognizes the vital role that women play in conservation and sustainable use of biological diversity, and affirming the need for full participation of women at all levels of policymaking and implementation for biodiversity. So when you cite and review these documents, you can hold them up, help others understand, but you also must preface perhaps or nuance your presentation by the fact that these are aspirational international values that are being stated. You may not be familiar with Protected Planet. I would suggest to you that you just go to the web and type in Protected Planet and the website will come up. What we actually have is a worldwide system of 16.25% of the terrestrial and 7.71% of the marine places on the planet that are protected in one of the IUCN categories. I list here on the left of the slide IUCN Category 5, which is essentially a place of interaction between people and nature over time, has been produced as a distinct character area, significant for a series of values, where safeguarding the integrity of this interaction between people and nature is vital to protecting and sustaining the area. And I would suggest to you that the way this is written up by IUCN is, in other words, a cultural landscape. Note that the protected planet areas, terrestrial and marine, store 15% of the global terrestrial carbon stock and assist in reducing deforestation, habitat, and species loss. They're economic assets, and they support the livelihoods of 1 billion people on the planet. Note also that protected doesn't necessarily mean secure. And the work of protecting protected places is a daily effort. So let's shift over to the culture side, and we see tangible and intangible cultural heritage as assets. And looking at cultural diversity and testing the word indigenous, again, 73 sites come up. And this sampling shows the ones that come up with the word indigenous. Note that in the case of the Jesuit missions, these right here in Argentina and Brazil, the Jesuit interaction with indigenous people is from a missionary and forced labor perspective of cultural dominance. So we're again looking at the dominant and the subdominant, the oppressed and those in power. In Canada, Pimachiwachin Aki is a mixed site that was put forward by First Peoples. If you wanted to investigate the difference in these, because this Canadian site, I believe, was listed in 2019, you will see a considerable difference in the narrative and the values stated throughout the OUV when you look at a site like Piwachimoa Aki and on writing on stone, Asinapi. These two sites have been put forward with the very close collaboration of First Peoples in Canada in recent years. And the image there was Parati, which I'm sure you're familiar with. So another way of querying the World Heritage List is to look at religious diversity. Some of you may be familiar with the ICOMOS GAP study that's nearly 20 years old, and a similar study about a balanced and defensible World Heritage List by the World Heritage Center. One of the points that it made was that Catholicism is overrepresented and the world's religions are underrepresented. So again, we're looking at who's first in the World Heritage List. There are many Gothic cathedrals on the list, for example. But in this case, we have a number of interesting vectors. Only 4 sites came up as Muslim, 21 as Jewish, 27 as Hindu, 56 as Catholic, and 39 as having Buddhist or pre-Buddhist roots. Now, if we look at the blend biocultural diversity with an indigenous search, we come up with 9 mixed World Heritage sites of the, I think I've got the number right, 38 overall mixed sites. And here are some examples. A mixed nomination is very interesting because it's an integration of values and assets, and it has to meet both the cultural and the natural criteria to be listed as a mixed site. It's possibly the most difficult nomination to achieve. So it's very good that Parati came forward as a mixed site, and recently, because the document is going to be a good reference for anyone studying the contemporary state of heritage. So for the Jamaican Blue and John Crow Mountains, there's an interesting description. It's a rugged, extensively forest mountainous region in southeast Jamaica Island, which provided the first refuge for indigenous Tainos fleeing slavery, and then for Maroons, former enslaved peoples. So we do have on the list a very few sites that recognize the enslavement process and the freedom of former slaves. Additionally, this site has a huge amount of endemic plant species, lichens, mosses, and flowering plants, and is a biodiversity hotspot for the Caribbean islands. These are images from Blue and John Crow. So I've presented this diagram of biocultural diversity and all of its overlaps so that we see that there is interchange. So we see that there is interrelationship. as a symmetrical diagram, but it is not truly symmetrical. In 2020, the UN Biodiversity Summit claimed that 75% of the Earth's terrestrial surfaces were deeply altered by humanity. So I show here human-shaped habitats larger than natural habitats. Probably the relationship is even more stark. At the same time, intangible heritage is under many pressures of global change, loss of elders, intergenerational transfer, and lack of recognition. The 2003 Intangible Heritage Convention forward notes cultural heritage is not only about the buildings and monuments of the past, it is also about the rich traditions that have been passed down the generations as vehicles of identity and social cohesion. This intangible cultural heritage needs to be protected and promoted. A recent site put forward by China, I think it was either 2018 or 2019, is a World Heritage Nature Site of migratory bird sanctuaries on the coast of the Yellow Sea, Bohai in the Gulf of China. Interesting here because while this nature inscription from China addresses migration and the biodiversity of land and marine expanse, it is a haven for the diverse avian species. It also is helping to protect this location in a migratory path that is much larger. And it requires similar parallel protection along the other parts of this path, or all the species that are threatened along, all the species that migrate along this corridor are threatened. Note that nature knows no state party boundaries. So placing it all together, bio and cultural diversity engages all of the heritage assets, and I would suggest to you that there are few these days that are without a nature and culture vector. Some may be more nature, some more culture, but a natural site requires human protection and care, as does a cultural site. I would be remiss if I didn't take this opportunity to highlight the UN Sustainable Development Goals, the Global 2030 Agenda. And when we think about the level of dysfunctions globally in our state parties, the amount of conflict, the amount of migration and refugees, it is amazing that we have achieved this agenda. That in 2015, the states parties of the world agreed to this amazing, very aspirational agenda. No poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being, quality education, gender equality, clean water and sanitation, affordable energy, decent work and economic growth, industry and innovation, reduced inequalities, sustainable cities and communities, responsible consumption and production, climate action, life below water, life on land, peace, justice, and strong institutions, and probably most importantly, partnerships for these goals. They're highly aspirational, but they actually have a series of measurable targets. And if you've only seen this image and you haven't dug into the 169 measurable targets, I suggest that you do so, and whatever you're working on, see which goals and which targets it fits into and promote that. Your work is linked to the global agenda. I found in searching for the UN SDGs this interesting scientific model. I'm sorry that this is in the way of the screen, but we have each of these as the icons for the goals. Note GE here is gender equality, IN is inequality, W is water, PO is poverty, and then up here I have another one which is peaceful societies. It's hiding under here, peaceful and inclusive societies. So when you look at the linkages, one of the strongest ones you see is this linkage between gender equality and peace. Also, just to express the complexity of this network, here's climate change over here. All of them have linkage to the climate crisis. Shifting a bit to urban heritage, I had the opportunity in 2015 to work with Mike and this very talented team to build a World Heritage, urban heritage study for the World Heritage Center. Our findings were surprising, showing a steep increase in urban nominations between 2009 and 2015. Here's the outcome. There were 571 urban heritage inscriptions, but they accounted for 1,631 different properties. So when we look at the list and the 1,121 overall nominations, we're not only looking at 1,121 properties, because serial nominations and transboundary nominations create a larger network. One of the things I do not believe we have as yet is an actual GIS base that shows the places that are inscribed on the World Heritage. We have a map overall, but we don't really know what the hectares or acreage is. Note also the disparity in who has the listings. France, by far and away the largest. Chile, Iran, India, down toward the bottom, but this is only the top grouping. So there are many states parties that don't have, we have 167 state parties of the 198, I believe, signers of the convention. So there are still parties who have signed the convention who have no sites. Traditional walled communal settlement here of Ait Ben Adu in Morocco. There are only 3 families in residence. It's a difficult daily life. Many families have moved across the river to the contemporary settlement that has contemporary elements. One gentleman welcomed us into his home, a collection of rooms on 3 stories with shared walls with other families on the other side of the wall, noting his pride in having a kitchen stove and a toilet for only 3 years. And for all the generations before, there had been no sanitary amenities and no cooking surfaces. And his mother had moved across the river to a modern house on 1 story. So we can't use our nostalgia for heritage to expect people to live a difficult life in the 21st century. Not that this isn't fabulous, but it's largely unoccupied and difficult to live in. The agricultural landscapes of the Philippine rice terraces are another important case. While the Ifugao region has a traditional school that is working to integrate children into traditional ways of life, and they have the sweet potatoes, the yams, and the rice, the organic rice that they grow on the terraces, this way of life is based on an animistic traditional belief system that everyone works together, and they live in high mountain regions with cold water agriculture of rice, and the social pressures of small settlements on mountainsides, the modern materials being brought in for some of these buildings on wet terraces in the mountainsides, and all of the issues of education for the next generation, the difficulties of daily life, and the erosion of beliefs and practices is pulling apart the ability for these rice terraces to continue as valued places with the people shaping their daily life. Again, recognize this issue of who benefits. These farmers who are actually living in the rice terraces are not gaining much benefit from the World Heritage nomination. The gains go to the tourists, the tourist operators, the hotels, the travel industry, not so much this year, but in the past. And the issues of civil unrest and social upheaval and poverty and the COVID pandemic and everything else are forcing traditional cultures against a wall of can they endure. So on a positive note, if you go slightly beyond World Heritage, starting with Stone Town in Zanzibar, on the island of Zanzibar, we had a historic urban landscape, a Hull workshop several years ago to look at Stone Town and Negombo, its immediate suburb, and the integration of Hull and the UN SDGs. Mohammed Juma right here is the planning leader for the area. These are all the folks that came in and were local. And Muhammad and I, after the session, talked about fostering island-wide planning for human settlements and agriculture, which probably he was already on board with, but I had gone out and looked at the countryside and seen the teak plantations being cut and the unmanaged sanitary wastes and the garbage dumps in the countryside, and thought that he really needed to think about that in overall planning. 2 years later, he brought forward this very interesting national spatial development strategy that incorporates all the UN SDGs and was looking at the aspects of enabling transformation on the threads of people, growth, investment, and environment, society as inclusive with equity, poverty alleviation, and mobility, the economy with employment, emerging technologies, and heritage as one of the drivers, and the environment with air, water quality, land use, food security, and livelihood. So the cultural assets of Zanzibar and Pemba Island were integrated into a territorial context. Heritage does not exist in its own envelope. It exists within the context of communities and their surrounding areas. So I ask in closing, as we begin the launch up to the celebration of the 50th anniversary of the World Heritage Convention, that we ask ourselves what the future vectors are for natural and cultural heritage in the next 50 years. As Irina Bokova says, tangible and intangible heritage are sources of social cohesion, factors of diversity, drivers of creativity and innovation, and urban regeneration. We must do more to harness this power. Where can heritage go from 2022 to 2072? It's up to us to shape an inclusive heritage future, well integrated to address the challenges, threats, and opportunities of today and tomorrow. Thank you.
So much, Patricia. It was very, very exciting. I come also from landscape field, so I'm just very pleased to listen to you and also to see the opportunities of debating and advancing our field. I just thank so much, Patricia, for responding so well for our questions, very precise, and also you help us think about so many questions, so many issues, so many ideas for debating, also for the researching and writing. And then I'll just pass floor to Flavia. Thank you so much, Patricia. It was a pleasure.
Yeah, so I think we've learned a lot today from Patricia. I once again thank you so much. It's been great. And I think there's a lot of overlapping in our Brazilian cases, that's for sure. A lot of things that we could still research more and more. And so it's been quite an opportunity for all of us hearing you and all these contemporary issues on World Heritage sites and these our World Heritage project. So we'll pass now, isn't that right, to Mike's presentation. And Patricia, I know that you have a lot to do. You have a agenda for today that it's late still in the US. So if there isn't much further ado, we should thank Patricia and say goodbye for the moment. For the moment. I know that you were kind of overwhelmed with all this our World Heritage stuff, but I mean, we couldn't miss the opportunity from having you here. So sorry if it bothered you in a way.
No,
but,
my pleasure. I would have said no if I couldn't do it, Flavia. So
okay, great. Yeah, that's right. So thanks.
Thank you for sharing and your generosity of sharing your ideas and also all your experience. It was very, 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 very good for us. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. And I hope you enjoyed Mike's presentation. Mike is a professor, and he is a professor, indeed. That kind of viewpoint. I was trying to be in contrast to his viewpoint because I wanted to push you into where we are now and where we need to go.
Yeah, sure. That's what we need to do very fast.
All of us.
Yes,
all
of us. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Patricia.
Bom, agora eu vou apresentar um pouquinho o Mike, né? E a gente passar também o Mike. Bom, ele é arquiteto, né? Desde 1975. Ele é um membro sênior do corpo docente do Departamento de Arquitetura da Academia de Arte e Design de Bezalel, em Jerusalém. Oferece cursos e seminários sobre processos de design, conservação e planejamento urbano. Ele tem uma longa história de envolvimento em várias organizações profissionais e acadêmicas, incluindo o Iucn Israel. Colaborou com a Unesco em vários projetos, incluindo a formulação e implementação da Recomendação sobre a Paisagem Urbana Histórica de 2011, né? HUL, né? Historical Urban Landscape. É assessor do diretor do Centro de Patrimônio do Patrimônio Mundial, Urban Heritage Center, em questões relacionadas à arquitetura, planejamento urbano e conservação. Além disso, ele contribuiu recentemente para vários projetos relacionados com a resiliência das cidades, nomeadamente como defensor do Escritório das Nações Unidas para a redução dos riscos de desastres.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to join you in Rio. I'm here in Jerusalem, Professor Mike Turner, and we'll be speaking about World Heritage in Focus. But first of all, I'd like to thank the Federal University in Rio, and specifically Vera and Monica, for inviting me to share some of the ideas together over the next half an hour. So it is World Heritage in Focus, and we should be particularly focusing on the taxonomy of values, authenticity, and integrity, their attributes, setting, and context, and of course, everything that is beyond. But when we look at these photographs, we think of World Heritage. We think about the wonderful monuments that have been left over the years, some of the natural habitats which are amazing, which we all love to visit and see. But strangely enough, there's another side to all this, and that is the civilizations were essentially created from conflict. Walter Benjamin put it that there's no document of civilization that was not at the same time a document of barbarism. All the way from Romulus and Remus, Agincourt and Ypres, and also from Waterloo to Austerlitz are ample proof of all this. And in fact, this was what created the UNESCO, the United Nations Education, Scientific and Cultural Organization. It was in 1945, at the end of the war, before the embers had not even cooled, that they determined that the ignorance of each other's ways and lives has been a common cause for that of suspicion and mistrust. and specifically that the means of communication between peoples and to employ these means for the purposes of mutual understanding and a truer and more perfect knowledge of each other's lives. In other words, to try to create some universal understanding about what we want life to do. And it was the World Heritage Convention that developed this idea of outstanding universal value. It is so exceptional as to transcend national boundaries and to be of common importance for present and future generations of all humanity. So this idea of being universal is a way by which we try to come together, and we try to then generate ideas and a platform for debate together. And it is also generates us in place and it generates us in time. So the common importance and the future of generations brings this together. But I'd like to question the idea that we speak about sustainable development and the idea of passing on to generations. David Reed questions whether it is meaningful to talk of sustainable development. We have no certainty of the needs of future generations, their ecological, social, and economic conditions, and how close we may be to such conditions. He implies that we need to consider whether this is an imprecise idealism unchecked by reality. And in fact, we are living in a period of uncertainties, of pandemics, of socio-political change, and economic pressures. So we cannot solve the problems of tomorrow with the tools of today. So within World Heritage, we are now looking at the idea of universal value, and it's this taxonomy which we would like to look at the universal level, and we'll just look at some of the parts, that is, of values, of attributes, authenticity, and integrity. I think that previous lectures spoke about the historic urban landscape, and there'll be future lectures looking at biodiversity with Patricia today, and also of interpretations, which we'll be looking at in the future. So the idea is that we have a series of words which come together and look at exactly how we evaluate our physical environment. They are essentially the values as defined by criteria through a comparative analysis are expressed by the attributes, qualified by their authenticity and integrity, and the conservation policy consists of management practices and other processes sustainably balancing external constraints, risks, and resources. So let's start with values. Values are defined within the Borough Charter as beliefs which have significance for a cultural group or individual, often including, but not being limited to spiritual, political, and religious and moral beliefs. And it goes on to say that places may have a range of values for different individuals or groups, and values are continually being renegotiated. Well, just look at the Forbidden City, which was quite forbidden in the 19th century. It became a center for the Mao and is now a tourist attraction. The Hagia Sophia started off as a church, moved into a mosque, became a museum, has now been re-inhabited as a mosque. So we can actually see that we have different values which are being negotiated all the time, and therefore questions almost, what does it mean outstanding universal value? It is this conflict and paradox between global and local. I'd also like to bring on board that Thomas Rochon actually speaks about cultural change. We have value conversion, that, for instance, slavery was acceptable and now is considered not acceptable. We have value creation, is that we never talked about concepts as sexual harassment, and this has now become new values which are being created. And we even have value connections with things which connect, which we never thought connected together, which looking at Newton's unification of theories of motion and Maxwell's unification of electricity and magnetism. So it is moving, it is always a moving target, which we have to begin to understand. So we have to then, within this basis, understand that the values which transcend national boundaries, but also then respect and respond to local conditions. But this is the very issue which is problematic, because the cultural heritage diversity might exist in time and between generations and space, but it demands respect for other cultures and also belief systems. And when they come in conflict, respect for cultural diversity demands acknowledgement of the legitimacy of cultural values of all parties. This is not too easy. We can probably manage this between 90% of the world's population, but we have fringe communities which are not willing to accept whatsoever that there's somebody else exists on this planet. And it was the NARA document in 1994 which actually tried to merge and to develop then this differentiation between global and local. And it was the understanding of authenticity plays a fundamental role in all scientific studies. And it is not possible to base judgments of values and authenticity within fixed criteria. Now, if one thinks about that, therefore, it actually makes a most complex relationship to exactly how we would like to then evaluate our heritage. So we've spoken about values, and we've spoken about that whether in fact we have universal values and how universal values are not so universal, and how we can then bring them together and merge the global and local. So the next test which we have about the values is that of authenticity and integrity. I would like to say that authenticity is the quality of the value and integrity is the quantity of the value. Authenticity says, how do we then, whether the property is really the given statement of significance it claims to be, and the integrity is how much do I see, do I understand it through what is on site. The word authenticity actually came into being in the Council of Trent in the end of the 16th century, when in fact there was a debate as to what was then the authentic text, the Catholic Church insisting on the Latin, and Luther as a Protestant then developing that there were possibilities of generating other languages like German. And they determined at the Council of Trent, at one of their meetings, that in fact it would be the Latin Vulgate would be regarded as authentic. But they knew quite well that in fact the Old Testament was in Hebrew, the New Testament was in Greek, yet they called the Latin Vulgate the authentic. They authenticated the value. And I think that this is what is critical about understanding authenticity. Here we can just look at the Capitol and the staircase to the Church of AUH and in Rome. I photographed it some years ago. Is this authentic? I can authenticate the value because I've got drawings of Piranesi of over 200 years ago, which probably says it was exactly the same. So authenticity is authenticating the value. The value might be in the use, not necessarily in the materials. Integrity is the measure of wholeness that includes all elements necessary to express the value. Its adequate size to ensure the complete representation of the features and processes which convey the property's significance. So if I was to say that the value of in Rio is that of the Copacabana beach, how much of the beach do I need to express this value? All of it? A small part? How much? So therefore, this is integrity. It is the minimum necessary and the maximum possible. The third part, which deals with the value, is the attributes. The values express themselves in an attribute. So what is an attribute? And I would like to come and reference Spinoza. And in his Ethics, he actually writes, an attribute, I mean that which the intellect perceives as constituting the essence of substance. This is great. It is the essence of the substance. So it is very, very tangible, which it actually looks at. But therefore, we begin to understand exactly, we have a value, the essence of its substance, therefore becomes then the attribute. The attributes originally were only in design, materials, workmanship and setting, very Eurocentric and very material based. In other words, purely looking at the monument as an element of architecture. But then after the Nara document, which that generated other ideas, we became to use in the issues, therefore, of use and function, of substance, of traditions and techniques, location, language, spirit and feeling, and other internal external factors. So we can see that the attributes have then developed and have become then more relevant then to understanding a wider range of values. And the values could be in layering, the values could be in continuity, the values might be in technology and sustainability, in tradition and pilgrimage, and not necessarily in the materials of the building. And this is the major opening that the Nara document gave to our understanding that of attributes. And we spoke about the issues of spirit and feeling, about the spirit of place, and this needs the intangible. And yet there's again a paradox in this, and is that we're speaking about the intangible, and yet we're talking about the essence of substance. We're talking about attribute that perhaps we can then manage. And it's this then paradox between the intangible and the intangible that we provide, therefore, the understanding of the soul of the city. The evidence of the past and cultural continuity, traditional knowledge, music, theatre. So it might not be the music itself, but the building which contains the music. The pilgrimages and journeys, it might be the streets which allow me to create the pilgrimage. They're the processions, the carnivals, the icons and ornaments, even though the carnival is here on one month and not there in other months, but it's the space of the carnival. And ICOMOS, in its Quebec Declaration on the Preservation of the Spirit of Place, tried to identify that there are the tangible and the intangible, and all this brings together the soul of the city. And without a soul, the city has just simply just an agglomeration, accumulation of buildings without any spirit, without any tradition or even memory. But all this actually takes place within setting and context. And I'd like to then look at what has happening around our conservation and buildings which are being preserved. So they suddenly are becoming islands in a city, or areas within development projects. And what is happening, that we're having volumes and shapes and iconic architecture is arriving in our cities. We have high-rise buildings, areas are being demolished, and there's new materials coming and greater urbanization. We can see this also just looking at the Tower of London and the Gherkin in the background, or the Alien in Graz, which is a World Heritage City, and Peter Cook and Colin Fernier's The Alien of the museum there. And look what happened in Lhasa, where they took down the marketplace and to put in, to open up, to dismember and see the palace of Lhasa in its glory. But I'd like to take then a page out of the understanding about theatre. And in theatre, what we have is that the setting and context. A setting is defined as where and when the text takes place. And the context is a situation or circumstances in which these events occur. So therefore, it is very important to understand the narrative, the literary element. The setting helps to initiate the main backdrop and move for a story. And the context is that which surrounds and gives meaning. And it is the context in any information that be used to characterize the situation. And it is before and after. It is then the time which we actually have to look at within the city. But this actually creates a situation that we have lots of pieces of history between time and place, which are completely confusing. Francis Bacon spoke about the shipwrecks of time, those elements which were left from the past, like the Sphinx in Egypt. Or we can look at the scars of history, which we can look at the revolution in Berlin. We can look at sites of conscience, like the island of Gorée, or even in Robben Island, and sites, therefore, which then give us memory, and that's of the Crusaders and the Cracker Chevalier. So all these, how do we put them in? These are part of the context which we actually try to understand, which creates the linear, creating us our continuity of understanding it. But these ruins are really complex ideas. To come back to Walter Benjamin, he actually mentions that in the ruin, history is physically merged into the setting. And in this guise, history does not assume the form of the process of an eternal life so much as that of irresistible decay. And he then speaks about that allegories in the realm of thoughts, what ruins are in the realm of things. This narrative of the city, our history, then become allegories which become ruins in the realms of things. And an allegory itself declares to be beyond beauty. I think this is an important part to understand exactly the relationship of these things of the past. But then we have the elements of the past and they become reinterpreted. Hannah Arendt, in her discussion about Martin Heidegger at 80, actually had written that the cultural treasures of the past, believed to be dead, are being made to speak, in the course of which it turns out they propose things altogether different than what have been thought at previous times and the previous banality. The past is a foreign country. This was initiated by the British novelist, but David Lowenthal, late geographer, eminent geographer, put in the past as a foreign country, and this is the essence of how we then look at the conservation. And lastly, if we want to look at this part of it, is that we have to understand there's another way of looking, and that is understanding synchronic and diachronic heritage. Again, making the comparison not just of theatre, but of language. A synchronic approach considers a language at a moment in time without taking history into account, which is really interesting. It is the diachronic approach which considers the development and evolution of a language through history, the connection, the continuity, which we're actually dealing with. So we could look at it essentially in city as about a project or process, growth and change. So Bath, the Royal Crescent in Bath, is most certainly a synchronic part. And in Prague, where each 50 years has got a new addition, which is then builds up into the spirit of the city, is a diachronic heritage. And then we can look at Monteregione, where in fact we have a bit of both. We've got synchronic and diachronic coming together. But it allows us a language to understand how do we address then our cities. And of course, this is going to be most important when we look at the last part in the actual Rio. Last week, we heard from Francesco Banderin, the history of the historic urban landscape. So just to pick up one critical part of it, that it speaks about that it is beyond the notion of the historic center or ensemble to include the broader urban context and geographical setting. So the urban context in its consequences, which we spoke about, the geographic setting, which is therefore time and place, which is then we actually look at. And the wider context includes a series of attributes. The attributes now are not just simply that of the physical building, but of the topography, the geomorphology, the hydrology, the natural features, the built environment, the open spaces and gardens, together with social and cultural practices, and also the intangible dimensions, together with land use patterns, spatial organization, and the history of all these monuments. So I think that now we've got then the historic urban landscape, and on this we have then a language which we can address then the world heritage. So Patricia was with us in 2009, looking at Rio de Janeiro and crafting the Carioca landscape with Katri Litzin. We had the opportunity, therefore, of discussing the landscape between the mountain and the sea, and this was in the basis of the original ICOMOS recommendation not to recommend the Rio as to the World Heritage. If we look at the current brief description, it speaks about dramatic landscape perceived of great beauty. It is natural structural elements constrained and inspired the development of the city, extensive designed landscapes reclaiming land on Copacabana Bay, together with flamenco and other parks contributing to the outdoor living culture of the city, and lastly, it is the best viewpoints. Of course, these viewpoints have been completely understood historically over the history of documentation in Rio from all its understanding. And in the 2009 workshop, we looked at the assessment of the city, its identity and uniqueness beyond the actual views, but the views which you can see over here, the actual form of the city, which is culture and nature, was really absolutely critical in developing this idea. Here we have the napkin, which we actually developed the proposal. Here it is to try to understanding between the mountain and the sea, and finally the drawings which were prepared for the actual nomination itself. Views became critical. But views, what are we preserving views? We preserve then corridors, view corridors. Why are they important for us? What is then the value which they give for us to understanding? It is prepares the identity. Is the view a value within itself, or is it a means for us to understanding other values? And this needs to be then expanded. We can look very carefully at some of the drawings which we prepared during that workshop to try to understand, therefore, the role of the water, which is also a biosphere reserve, the entrance to the bay, to understanding the relationship to the sea and to the mountains. And of course, everybody understands then this amazing format and exactly how then the city then becomes evolved. And in the presentation, they spoke about authenticity and integrity. They looked at it that these were essentially express the attributes of authenticity and integrity in the following table. I think that we're looking now beyond this. This is the challenge of what we need to do. The features no longer are just 5 features. We have to then think about other features which might come about. The features are essentially the attributes. Then the values are measured through authenticity and integrity. And a lot of the aspects of the integrity here are essentially the management allowing that quantity to take place. So we can just look at these attributes over here, look at the urban forms of the favela, of the built form, and the nature and its integration is obviously one of, therefore, of outstanding universal value. And so the parts which make this up are the botanical gardens, are the promenades and the great designs of Burle Marx, Oscar Niemeyer, and Lucia Costa. But we also have to discuss beyond this Carioca landscape. We said, what are the challenges for the future? Why aren't the favelas part of this cultural landscape? Are they just simply not acceptable? What about the views and the technologies of the trams going to Santa Teresa? And what about all the settlements which are taking place on the other side of the bay? We have to think beyond the historic center and ensemble. And this is also beyond the Carioca landscape, which will move us into a new generation and redefining our heritage for the future. Perhaps I would like to then give you to think about then this future with a quote from Don Quixote. When life itself seems lunatic, who knows where madness lies? Perhaps to be too practical is madness, to surrender dreams. This may be madness. Too much sanity may be madness, and maddest of all, to see life as it is, not as it should be. I think that this should be an interesting message for the future, and not to reuse the past, but to actually reinterpret it so as to be able to make a better future for next generations. Thank you.
Obrigada a todos pela presença, foi excelente.
Muito obrigada.
Tarde.
Obrigada de novo a nossa
Isso.
equipe, Alex, Lamunier, Cláudia Muniz, Larissa Silva, Bianca Martins, Ana Paola, Yasmin Darviche.
Isso mesmo. Muito obrigada.